The auctioneer had been working on it for 4 solid minutes, and in 4 minutes, not one hand in that yard had gone up. It lay on its side in the wet grass behind the equipment barn, a tube of green-black metal almost 12 feet long, thick as a stovepipe at one end and flared at the other, bolted through the middle to a rusted cast-iron carriage that had to weigh 400 pounds by itself. Somebody had dragged it out of a county storage shed that morning with a chain and a loader bucket, and the chain had cut bright scars down through the corrosion. Rain had gotten into the open end. There was a wasp nest up in the throat of it, and a dent in the flank the size of a dinner plate where something heavy had been set down on it a long time ago. Colonel Buddy Renner had sold 400 lots since 8 that morning. A manure spreader, 9 feed bunks, a school piano missing 2 keys, a coffee can of doorknobs. Now he was standing on an overturned milk crate in front of the last lot on the sheet, and he was losing. "Give me 100 for the brass," he said. "There is $100 of brass laying right there in the grass. Nobody moved. Give me 50. A man near the front called out, loud enough to carry all the way to the fence line, "I will give you 50 to haul it off." That got the laugh. And once a crowd laughs at a lot, that lot is finished. It was the second Saturday of April, 1981, and there were about 140 people standing in the mud at the old fairgrounds outside Corley, Ohio. Every one of them had already decided what the thing was. It was pipe. It was a smokestack. It was something a factory threw out and somebody's grandfather hauled home. 2 men had spent the whole morning telling each other it came off a fire truck. The man who made the joke was Dale Perky, who farmed 300 acres north of town and wore the same mustard-tan jacket to every sale in the county. Dale had a way of standing with his weight on one leg and his chin up, and he used it now. "Buddy," he said, "you could not give that away. Cut it in half, and you have got 2 culverts." Renner tried one last time. $25, he said, and I am embarrassed to ask it. And a voice from the back of the crowd, flat and unhurried, said, $85. Every head turned. Renner did not even go looking for a raise. He said sold, wrote it down, and stepped off the milk crate, and the crowd made the noise a crowd makes when it thinks it has watched a man make a mistake in public. The buyer was Harlan Doss. He was 61 years old, built heavy through the shoulders, in bib overalls and a straw hat gone the color of weak tea. He walked down through the crowd, paid at the clerk's wagon, and came back with a small yellow paper tag on a wire. Somebody had written 85 on it in grease pencil. He untwisted the wire, folded the tag once, and put it in his shirt pocket. Dale Perky followed him out. "What in the world are you going to do with that, Harlan?" "Set it up," Harlan said. "Set it up where?" "In the yard." Dale laughed the whole way back to his truck. Here is what the yard did not know about the man who had just spent $85. Harlan Doss had been a machinist for 31 years. He kept the Corley grain elevator running and half the combines in the township besides. He could cut a thread by eye and get it right. And in the winter of 1959, out of boredom and a magazine article, he had ground his own telescope mirror on the back porch, 8 inches across, out of a glass blank that came in a wooden crate packed in excelsior. It took him 7 months. He wore the skin off 2 fingertips. He learned, the way you only learn by doing it, exactly what a piece of figured optical glass costs and exactly how long it takes to make one. So when Harlan Doss walked past that tube in the weeds on the Thursday preview, he did not see pipe. He saw a telescope, and not a small one. If you've made it this far into Harlan's story, hit subscribe. Because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The preview had been open from noon to 6, and Harlan spent most of it on the ground beside that tube with a flashlight, doing a thing that looked to everybody else like a man too cheap to leave a sale. What he was doing was reading it. The tube was not welded. It was rolled sheet brass with a lapped and riveted seam, and the rivets were set in a line as straight as a fence wire, which is not how you build a culvert and is exactly how you build an instrument. The narrow end carried a cast fitting with a machined dovetail and 4 brass thumb screws, which is a focuser, and the flared end was not flared at all. It was a dew cap, and inside the dew cap 4 inches down there was a heavy ring of cast brass with knurled edges, and behind the knurling there was glass. Harlan put the flashlight against the tube and squinted down past his own reflection and saw the light bend. Not a window, a curve. Something in there was ground. Then he found the mount. Under the mud and the pitted iron, it was a German equatorial, 2 axes crossing at an angle, a great counterweight shaft, a slow-motion worm gear the size of a dinner roll, and down at the base a sealed cast iron box with a wound spring drum and a governor inside it. That box was a clock, a weight-driven clock drive, built to turn the whole instrument at the exact rate the sky turns, so a star put in the eyepiece would stay there while a man looked at it. Nobody builds a clock into a culvert. And on the outer rim of the lens cell, half swallowed under 100 years of green, there was engraving. Harlan could not read it. He could feel it, though. He rubbed one thumb across a spot the size of a postage stamp, felt the tops of the letters catch, and then, and this is the part that mattered, he stopped. He put his hand flat over the spot, sat back on his heels, and looked out at the crowd. Then he stood up, wiped his hands on his overalls, and spent the rest of the preview looking at a hay rake he had no intention of buying. He did not clean that engraving in front of 140 people. He waited 2 days and bought it for $85. Now, where does a 12-foot brass telescope come from in a county with no stoplight? It came from Whitcomb Academy, which sat on a hill 2 miles east of Corley from 1871 until it closed in 1969. In 1889, the Academy built an observatory, because in 1889, that is what a serious school did. It was a round brick drum with a wooden dome sheathed in tin by a local tinsmith, and the dome turned on a track made of cannonballs in a groove, and inside it the Academy put a refracting telescope with an 8-inch objective on a cast iron equatorial mount. For 80 years the town looked through it. There are people in Corley who saw the rings of Saturn for the first time standing in that drum in a winter coat. Then enrollment fell, the Academy closed, the building sold to a man who wanted the land, and the dome sat there with a busted shutter until 1971. When the county took what was left inside and put it in a storage shed with the voting booths and the fair grandstand risers. It sat in that shed for 10 years. In 1981, the county cleaned out the shed and everything in it went to the fairground sale. And the last lot on the sheet was a tube of green-black metal that nobody could remember the purpose of. Getting it home took Harlan and 3 neighbors and most of a Sunday. The tube alone was 240 pounds, and the mount was closer to 600. They ran chains under it and lifted it with a loader bucket with a folded moving blanket over the teeth. And Harlan stood underneath the whole time with his hands up like a man catching something falling, which annoyed everybody and which he did anyway. Ruth came out on the step and looked at what was coming off the flatbed into her yard. How much? she said. $85. She looked at it a while longer. Well, she said, it is the biggest $85 I have ever seen. Then the cleaning started, and the cleaning took 3 weeks. He would not touch it with a wire wheel. He said a wire wheel on brass is like a chainsaw on a wedding cake. What he used was kerosene and rags and rotten stone powder, and his hands an hour or two every evening after supper working a square foot at a time. The whole shop smelled like kerosene and burnt dust. Ruth said she could smell it in his shirts through 2 washings. Under the green, the brass came up the color of an old trumpet. Under the rust on the mount, he found the setting circles, 2 silvered rings with the degrees still legible. And on the 11th evening, on the outer rim of the lens cell, under the last of the corrosion, the engraving came up out of the metal like writing coming up in a photograph. It said Alvin Clark & Sons. Cambridgeport, Mass., 1889, Harlan Doss sat down on an upturned bucket in his own shop and did not move for a while. If you do not know the name, here is why a man would sit down. Alvin Clark and his sons made the finest telescope lenses in the world in the second half of the 1800s out of a shop in Massachusetts. Not the finest in America, the finest anywhere. 4 times they made the biggest lens on earth, and 4 times when somebody caught up, they beat them again. In 1981, there were collectors and universities who would take an 8-inch Clark at almost any price, because the man who could make another one had been dead for 90 years. Harlan had bought a signed Clark refractor at a farm sale for $85. He went to bed that night and by his own account did not sleep much. The next evening he set up 2 padded sawhorses, took the dew cap off, and backed the retaining ring out to clean the glass. 4 screws. He laid them on a rag in a row so he would not lose them, tipped the cell, and the objective came out into his hands. And Harlan Doss stood in his shop holding it and understood in about 4 seconds that he had been robbed 100 years before he ever showed up. It was one piece of glass. A Clark objective is 2, a crown and a flint. A matched pair figured to work together and separated by 3 little foil spacers. This was one flat disc, 1/8 of an inch thick, cut round with a wheel chatter still on the edge. Ordinary window glass. It was not seated on foil. It was seated on 4 folded shims of cardboard, and when he turned one of the shims over in the light, he could read part of a soap carton on it. And in the cell, under where the shim sat, there were 2 sets of screw holes, an old set filled with dirt, and a newer set drilled off by a few degrees by somebody in a hurry. The lens was gone. Somebody had taken the whole reason the thing existed out of that tube and put a piece of window glass in its place and closed it up. And it had sat in a dome and in a shed and in a wet field for who knows how long, looking complete, fooling everybody, including the man who paid for it. He told Ruth that night. She asked him if he was going to be sick about it. He said he was going to be sick about it for 1 day, and then he was going to go find it. Because here is the thing about a piece of window glass cut round and shimmed with a soap carton. A thief does not do that. A thief takes the lens and leaves the hole. Whoever pulled that objective wanted the tube to look right afterward. Somebody had done it carefully, on purpose, and had wanted nobody to notice. The Corley Historical Society lived in 2 rooms over the old bank, and it opened Tuesdays. Harlan Doss became a Tuesday regular for the next 2 months. What the society had was 11 cardboard boxes of Whitcomb Academy paper, trustee minutes, ledgers, a scrapbook of every class photograph from 1893 to 1968, He read all of it, with his finger under the lines, and Mrs. Vaught, the volunteer, brought him coffee and eventually stopped asking what he was after. He found it in the trustee minutes for October of 1948. There had been a hailstorm in July of that year that broke the dome shutter, and the dome had stood open to the weather for most of a summer before anybody got up there. The minutes are one dry line. The objective lens has been removed from the telescope for cleaning and safekeeping and is in the care of Mr. Ostrander pending repair of the dome. That was the whole entry. There was never another one. The dome was patched in 1951, badly. Nobody wrote a single word about putting the glass back. Ellis Ostrander taught physics at Whitcomb Academy from 1931 until he died in the spring of 1963. Harlan found him in 14 class photographs, a narrow man with round glasses at the end of the back row, getting older one picture at a time. In the 1954 yearbook, there is a photograph of him at the eyepiece, captioned that Mr. Ostrander opens the dome on clear Thursdays for anyone who cares to climb the hill. Except that by 1954, the dome had a lens in it made out of window glass. Harlan thought about that a long time, and his best guess stayed his best guess for the rest of his life. Ostrander pulled the good glass out of a wet tube in 1948 to save it, which was the right call. Then the repair money never really came. The patch job leaked, and the roof over that telescope was never sound again. So the lens stayed in his care. And a man who opens the dome on clear Thursdays for the whole town cannot very well open it onto an empty tube. So he cut a disc of window glass to hold the shape of the thing and told himself it was until the roof got fixed. It never got fixed. He did it for 15 years, and then in the spring of 1963, he died on a Tuesday, and everything he knew went with him. The Academy had no idea. The county had no idea. They sold the tube in a field for $85. Ostrander had never married. Harlan found the obituary. It named one surviving relative, a niece, Alma Reddick, and in the spring of 1982, Alma Reddick was 74 years old and living 9 miles out on a gravel road in the same house her uncle had died in. Harlan called first. Then he drove out and sat in her kitchen and explained it twice, and she was polite about it and completely certain there was nothing of the kind in the house. He asked if there was anything of her uncle's she had never gone through. She said the closet in the back hall was full of his boxes and always had been, and she had opened 3 of them in 19 years, and they were all schoolwork. They went and looked. 9 boxes of paper. And under the bottom shelf, shoved back against the wall, a wooden crate about 18 inches square, dovetailed at the corners with rope handles gone stiff and a cleat nailed across the lid. Alma had a folded towel sitting on top of it. She stood on that crate every canning season to reach the top shelf, and had for as long as she could remember, and had never once wondered what was in it, because it was under a shelf, and it was in the way, and it had always been there. On the lid, in pencil, in a narrow hand, it said Academy, glass, carry level. Harlan asked her if he could open it, and his voice did not work right on the first try. They carried it to the kitchen table. He took the cleat off with a screwdriver and lifted the lid. Under the lid was a layer of sawdust, and under the sawdust a wool army blanket folded over twice, and under the blanket a wooden ring. And set into the ring, face down, separated by 3 little tabs of foil, 2 discs of glass. He turned the top one over. The edge was ground flat, and on the flat, in letters about 1/16 of an inch high, it said Alvin Clark and Sons, and a number. Harlan went out to his truck and came back with the retaining ring off the telescope and set it on the table beside the crate. and the number stamped inside the cell and the number cut into the edge of the glass were the same number. Alma Reddick had been standing on it to reach her peaches for 19 years. She told him to take it. He would not. He wrote her a check for $200 there at the table, which was more money than she wanted and less than the glass was worth by a factor she would not have believed. And he made her agree to one other thing, which was that she would come out to his place on the first clear night after he got it in. That took until October. He would not rush it. He cut a new cell shim out of cork, freed the clock drive with penetrating oil over 5 weeks, rebuilt the governor, and made one bronze bushing from scratch. He built a new pier out of white oak because the original had rotted to punk in the shed. Then he set the mount on a concrete pad in the corner of the yard and aligned the axis on the pole star over 3 cold nights with a plumb bob and a lot of arithmetic on the back of a feed receipt. On the 19th of October, 1982, Harlan Doss put the Clark objective back into the tube it came out of in 1948 and released the clock drive, and it began to tick. Alma Reddick was there. So was Ruth and 4 neighbors and Mrs. Vaught from the Historical Society. It was cold and the sky was hard and black and there was no moon. He swung the tube up and found Saturn, and he stepped back and he put Alma at the eyepiece first. She looked a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Oh, just that." She asked whether her uncle had ever seen it like this, and Harlan told her the truth, which was that Ellis Ostrander was the last man who had, 34 years before. Word got around a county fast. In August of 1982, before the lens even went back in, Harlan had written to the astronomy department at the State University because he wanted the number confirmed by somebody who had a right to confirm it. Dr. Marion Keel drove out on a Saturday expecting to look at somebody's brass junk and be home by 3. He was there 6 hours. He measured the tube and the cell, read the engraving with a hand glass, checked the number against a published list, and then asked to use the telephone. Then he stood in the yard in front of Harlan and Ruth and Dale Perky and about a dozen neighbors who had drifted over the way neighbors do when a strange car has been parked somewhere too long. And he said that this was a documented Alvin Clark & Sons 8-inch refractor, complete, with its original signed objective and its original clock drive, one of perhaps a few dozen surviving in that condition anywhere, and that if it went to auction in the right room, he would expect it to bring $35,000, and that he personally hoped it would not. Nobody in that yard said anything for a second or two. Dale Perky was standing at the back with his hands in the pockets of that mustard jacket. He had made the joke that started the Laugh 16 months before. He did not make one now. Harlan did not sell it. He had a figure in his head that he told exactly 2 people, and the figure was what a new dome cost. In 1984, the Corley School Board took a proposal from a retired machinist to put a 14-foot rotating dome on the flat roof of the high school science wing, and Harlan Doss paid for a little over half of it out of his own pocket and built the rotation track himself, on the same principle as the old one, and put the Clark in it on permanent loan, with a deed of gift dated for the day he died. The dome opens on clear Thursdays. That was his condition, and it was not negotiable, and it is the same night Ellis Ostrander used to open the old one, and Harlan never made a speech about that, but he chose it. 400 people came the first night. They stood in a line that went down the stairs and out into the parking lot, and it took until 1 a.m. to get everybody through. And the thing they were lining up to look at was a piece of pipe that 140 people had laughed at in a wet field for $85. Dale Perky stood in that line for an hour and 10 minutes with his granddaughter on his shoulders. When he got to the top of the stairs, he looked at the tube on its mount in the dark, turning slowly, ticking, and he said, to nobody in particular, well, it is not just pipe. Harlan was at the eyepiece and did not look up. He said, no, it never was. Inside the door of that dome, in a little frame Ruth made him buy, there is a folded yellow paper tag with 85 written on it in grease pencil. Ruth said the thing that everybody quotes now, and she said it in her own kitchen, not to a crowd. She said Harlan never got lucky in his life. He just looked at things longer than other people were willing to. That is the whole difference. Every person at that sale walked past the same object, with the same eyes and the same daylight and the same 6 hours of preview. The engraving was right there on the rim under 100 years of green, waiting for anybody willing to get down in the mud with a flashlight. And the lens itself sat in a back hall closet for 19 years with a folded towel on top of it, under a woman who stood on it every August in a crate that said glass on the lid in pencil. It was never hidden. It was only unlooked at. Harlan Doss died in 1998. The dome still opens on clear Thursdays.